The gravity that NASA forgot. NASA did a commendable job in giving the pro-NASA group enough evidence to prove that the astronauts were on the moon. The problem is that there were one or two gaps in this evidence that fatefully slipped through. There is another pendulum in the NASA videos which I suspect was unexpected and therefore not faked by NASA. This occurs on the Apollo 15 mission when astronaut Dave Scott ran past the flag and it started to swing. First, let us look at the incident in this video posted by Joe Rogan. Also, we have Jara White with something to say about these flapping flags in this two-part video series. This moving flag instance has been the subject of much discussion relating to whether there is an atmosphere and the astronaut disturbed the air as he passed by it, thereby showing that it was filmed in a studio on Earth. What we are interested in here is not what caused the flag to move, but how the flag moves. The disturbance of the flag, irrespective of how it was caused, starts the flag to sway back and forth. The leading edge of the flag is acting like a quasi-pendulum is that it displays simple harmonic motion so that with the other NASA pendulum, it is possible to analyze its movement. This is done in a video from Steve the Chemist. In this video, Steve proves conclusively that the swaying flag is definitely in the gravitational force of the Earth. The analysis by Steve the Chemist is excellent, but he has seemingly forgotten one important aspect. The Apollo videos almost always contain a certain amount of slow motion, and not by taking this into account, Steve has by default assumed that he is viewing the action in real time. That scene will have some slow motion, although perhaps not a lot. As I will discuss in Chapter 12, the amount of slow motion was reduced the nearer the astronauts were to the camera, otherwise their movement would look too glacial. The inclusion of the slow motion effect would improve Steve's analysis as the swinging time for the pendulum would be a little faster, less than the 2 seconds he measured from the NASA video. I cannot know exactly what the slow motion factor would be for this scene, but it is likely to be small as the astronaut is close to the camera. I would estimate between 10% to 20%. If I assume 20% slow motion, then the real period of the swing would be 1.6 seconds, which matches almost perfectly for the flag swinging in Earth's gravity. There is absolutely no question that this was filmed on Earth. The flag moved just far too quickly to be in the gravity of the moon, and the calculations prove it. Clearly, NASA would not have been aware of the discovery of this unexpected anomaly and therefore oblivious to its relevance. More faked gravity. NASA also included many jumping astronauts, no doubt to enable the gravity to be calculated by its faithful supporters. In order to give the effect of being in lesser gravity, they had the astronauts suspended on counterbalance wires and used various slow motion techniques. There is one famous scene in which astronaut John Young is being photographed by fellow astronaut Charles Duke on the Apollo 16 mission as Charles Young makes a jump and salutes. It is often referred to as the Big Navy salute. Watch this video posted by Dave Watcher. Pay particular attention to the actual jump sequence and note how the moon dust falls from the astronaut's feet. It appears to strangely accelerate towards the ground. It looks totally unnatural. This jump salute video has been analyzed by Steve the Chemist in this video posted on YouTube. Steve observes that there is something rather strange about this jump video and compares it with a similar jump of a volleyball player. He maintains that the physics dictate that the astronaut would fall back to the ground together with the dirt. However, we do not see this, but what we do see is the astronaut still rising while the dirt falls back to the ground. Physics tells us that all objects must fall at the same rate and at the same time, irrespective of what gravitational forces they are both under. The astronaut here is making a jump perhaps of 9 to 10 inches. In fact, the jump is the same height as the dirt goes. Then the astronaut is pulled up by the counterbalance wire to complete the jump. The giveaway to this is the fact that if you closely watch the slowed down version, you will see that the backpack rises before the astronaut, which is clear evidence that he is being pulled up on a wire attached to his backpack. What you would expect to see is the astronaut rise first, then his body would pull the backpack up. Just look at the space between the top of the backpack and the astronaut's head. The backpack rises a good 3 to 4 inches above the astronaut's head, showing clearly that the backpack is being pulled up by the wire. This is clear, indisputable evidence and exposes the fakery. Now, as we might imagine, the pro-NASA group will not let it end there. We have this rather charming posting on YouTube from the pro-NASA devotee Shane Killian, who manages to cram more insults into his video than actual science. Unfortunately, this video proves nothing, as he rejoices that he can show that the astronaut and the dirt fell at the same rate, showing clearly that he does not understand physics. It is not the rate at which they fall that is the problem, it is that one event occurs before the other. They both rise at the same time, so they must fall at the same time. It is as simple as that. In whatever gravity with no atmosphere, all objects must rise and fall at the same time. His observational skills are also somewhat lacking, as he fails to notice, or perhaps doesn't want to notice, that the backpack rises before the astronaut. This is fairly typical of the pro-NASA group. What they apparently lack in their knowledge of science is made up with completely unnecessary insults to anyone who dares to disagree with their point of view. However, Shane Killian is not happy to leave it there, but has a propensity to embarrass himself further with this video in which he wants to prove how tall an astronaut is. I could go on and on about this, but far better that I just leave it here. The pseudoscience that the pro-NASA group need to use to defend NASA is nothing less than Olympian. They put up some flawed argument which appears to satisfy their fan base. The next time the same subject arises, they simply say, "I debunked that already." It is simple. If two bodies are propelled upwards at the same time, but one of them comes down later than the other, then it can only be assumed that some external force has been applied. In this case, the wire supporting the astronaut. That is simple, indisputable physics. You can clearly see what I consider to be the ultimate proof that NASA is faking gravity in this video so far. Reduced gravity, reduced jump height. If you have been paying attention, then you know by now that the moon's gravity is 1/6 of that of the Earth. This is due to the relative sizes of the Earth and the moon, and therefore their masses as I plainly described above. I personally recall a magazine article sometime in the 60s about the moon and its much lower gravity than here on Earth. The article highlighted the fact that humans would be super athletes on the moon due to such low gravitational force. On Earth, an average athlete can do a standing vertical jump to say, about 2 feet. So they postulated that on the moon, man could do a standing vertical jump at least 12 feet high, or maybe 6 feet high in a cumbersome spacesuit. Similarly, a man could do a standing long jump of 4 feet on Earth, so they expected him to do a long jump of at least 12 feet on the moon. I and many others could not wait to see the display of superpowers our comic book superheroes finally brought to life. Naturally, the astronauts were not kitted out for athletics with Nike trainers and shorts, but nonetheless, they would be able to amaze us with their new powers. These athletic superpowers were even confidently predicted in 1964 by NASA themselves. Well, we were all bitterly disappointed. The astronauts did nothing to amaze us. In fact, they look rather pedestrian. When they did make the effort to jump, it was only about a maximum of 18 inches, seemingly nothing different from being on Earth. Of course, they were wearing their spacesuits and backpacks, but their weight was 1/6 of the Earth's weight, and their terrestrial muscles must have been adapted to Earth's greater gravity so that they could be much stronger on the moon. The initial force the astronaut can exert just before he jumps is the same on Earth or on the moon. It is not a function of gravity, but purely of muscle strength. The skeptics have labored on this point that the astronauts did not appear to be in a lesser gravity than on Earth, which leads them to suggest that the astronauts never left the Earth. This lack of jump height on the moon is discussed in this video by Gerald White. He comments on the fact that no astronaut is observed to jump more than a couple of feet on the moon. You will notice at time 235 in this video, Jera shows an insert video of the astronauts making some higher jumps. Notice at the beginning of this video the astronaut on the right. He bends his leg, crouches, and then makes 4 distinct jumps and then remains stationary. Well, stationary until a second or so later he is suddenly involuntarily yanked up by the wire. Absolute proof the wires were employed to simulate Moon's gravity. The astronaut made no attempt to perform that 5th jump. Summary. So what did we learn in this chapter? Well, we examined the pendulum created by the flag, which showed clearly it was swinging in Earth's gravity, and the mathematics backed this up almost precisely. We saw that the big naval salute video was inconsistent with physics law and shows clear evidence of the astronaut being pulled up by a wire. This was shown by the fact that the backpack rose before the astronaut. We saw the dirt fall before the astronaut, which is impossible as all objects must fall at the same rate and at the same time. You cannot have dirt falling before the astronaut. Finally, we observed that the astronauts were not capable of producing any jumps higher than they would have on Earth, and when they did attempt it, we had absolute proof of them being yanked up by wires. All of these facts show clearly the videos were faked by NASA in an attempt to convince us that the astronauts were on the moon and subject to the lesser moon gravity. Unfortunately for NASA and its dedicated fan base, the deceit is clearly revealed. Give every man thy ear, but few thy choice. William Shakespeare, Hamlet. No sound in a vacuum. We hopefully understand by now that there is virtually no atmosphere on the moon. It is to all intents and purposes a total vacuum. No doubt we will all remember that demonstration at school in the physics lecture of the bell inside of the glass jar. The bell is ringing loudly and can be heard through the glass jar, but as the air is pumped out of the jar, the sound diminishes until finally, as a near vacuum is reached, the sound stops. This experiment was to show that sound travels in comprehensive airways and that with no air, as in the vacuum, then there cannot be any sound. In case you missed this demonstration at school, then let's take a look at what I am talking about. I did wonder at the time how useful this knowledge would be to me. I mean, how often was I likely to be trapped in a vacuum calling for help? Now with my acquired knowledge, I am at the forefront of science, able to understand this whole sound in a vacuum business. You may be wondering why I am talking about sound on the moon. Well, I don't hear any sound when I think I should, and I hear sound when I think I shouldn't. Clearly, there is no pleasing some people. Not enough sound. First of all, no sound when I would expect to hear it. What does this mean? This occurs when the astronauts are in their spacecraft with the noise of the rocket engines blasting away, but they are still able to talk crystal clearly and there is no audible sound from the engine. The best example of this given in the descent of the lunar lander towards the moon's surface. This is mentioned at time 136 by Bill Casing in this video. If you listen to the astronauts talking to Houston as the lunar module descends to the moon's surface, then the conversations are crystal clear with no noise in the background. The two astronauts are virtually sitting on top of the 10,500-pound thrust descent engine, which even working at 3,000 pounds force thrust must be extremely noisy, but we do not hear any sound from the rocket. There would be no sound emanating from outside of the lunar lander in the vacuum of the moon, but inside is the capsule's atmosphere. One would imagine it would be quite noisy. NASA explains this by stating that the astronauts are wearing their spacesuits, so the sound of the rocket engine is not heard because the astronaut's microphone is well shielded from the outside sound. The only thing you can hear, in addition to the astronauts and mission control, is a slight amount of static. Some moon landing skeptics say that it is not possible that they were wearing spacesuits. The logic being, in that order to handle the computer controls which guide the descent, then the astronauts need to push buttons on a small computer keypad. The keys on the Apollo computer keypad were about 3 times the size of those on a standard desktop computer keyboard. I suggest that you try to type your next email wearing gardening gloves to get the idea. You may wonder how when your life depends on it, are you really going to take a chance on hitting the wrong button and bringing your moon holiday to a sudden end? The skeptics are certain that the astronauts were not wearing their spacesuits. They also say that whenever they see astronauts inside the lunar lander, they are not wearing their spacesuits. So the debate seems to hinge on whether the astronauts were wearing their spacesuits or not. The skeptics say no, but I am not sure. The Apollo flight plan did call for the astronauts to be suited up in their spacecraft for the lunar module landing, so if they did follow the flight plan, then they were wearing their spacesuits. This was a standard procedure as well as safety precautions in case the lunar module's outer skin was damaged in the landing. This is also stated in the video at time 9:38. So far, I have been unable to find any definitive video evidence that they were wearing their spacesuits. The Discovery program does show at times 37 and then again at 38:28 that the astronauts appear to be wearing their spacesuits. I have no idea if these clips are true NASA videos. If you are interested to know how the landing was achieved, there is a dramatization in the mini-series From the Earth to the Moon by Home Box Office TV. The skeptics also say that there is a very similar situation with the takeoff from the moon. In this case, the astronauts stood immediately by the side of the 3,000-pound forced thrust descent engine, but in the transmissions, immediately on liftoff, there is no sound of the rocket, and the astronauts can be clearly heard. I need to add here that it must also have been quite hot standing by that rocket, as it burnt at 2,000 Celsius, but nobody seems to mention the excessive heat, or perhaps I'm just wrong. We have the same debate, were they wearing their spacesuits or not? The Apollo flight plan did call for them to be wearing their spacesuits, so if they followed the plan, then they did don on their spacesuits. I expect that you will be inclined to go with NASA on this one. If the astronauts followed the flight plan, and we have no evidence to suggest that they didn't, then they would be wearing their spacesuits, and consequently, the rocket engine noise would probably not be heard in the voice transmissions. Too much sound. The important point here is that whatever actions are taking place on the moon, we should not be able to hear any sound. Imagine if you were a moon dweller and you saw this strange-looking craft descend towards the moon with its rockets lit up, but there was no sound. Well, at least that's what we should expect according to the science of the glass bell jar. We would imagine that any moon dwellers would have no use sign language. In some NASA videos, it is possible to identify actions by astronauts in which a distinct sound can be clearly heard, which shouldn't be possible if they really are on the moon. We will start with a video from Daniela from the Apollo 16 mission. The astronaut is shown lifting and closing a lid container on the lunar rover, and then there is a distinct sound. Later in the video, you can even hear the astronaut's footsteps as he shuffles in the lunar dust. Similarly, in a video from Street Cap 1, in which the hammer sound is clearly audible. On the moon with no medium to transmit the sound, then it should not be possible to hear any sound. The question of sound is also covered exhaustively by Jet Windsor. He looks in detail at the question of sound being heard in the Apollo mission video and the acknowledgement of this by NASA. The incident of the hammer below is mentioned in the transcript in the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. The contorted answer from NASA is that the sound was transmitted through the astronaut's gloves into his suit, through the oxygen atmosphere in his suit, and picked up by his internal microphone. The Apollo Lunar Surface Journal states this: "What seems likely is that when Gene hits the rock, the hammer rebounds against the palm of the pressurized glove, creating a sound wave in the suit loud enough to be picked up by the microphone at Gene's lips. In brief, the suit acts like a drum." This explanation by NASA is challenged by Windsor, who draws parallels with the International Space Station videos in which he transfers the sound through their spacesuits does not appear to happen when astronauts work outside in space. He also states that the sound heard is not what you would expect if the spacesuit was acting like a drum, but it is clear, distinct metallic sound of a metal hammering striking the metal pole of the flagstaff. He also identifies what seems to be a tactic admission by NASA that something was amiss. This relates to a web page shown in the section Lunar Science for Kids, which was intended to educate children about the fact that there was no sound possible in a vacuum on the moon. It was placed on the NASA website in 2009, and it states, "Sound needs something to travel through to get from one place to another. On the moon, since there is no air, sound cannot travel above the surface, so there is no sound on the surface of the moon. When the Apollo astronauts were out on the moon's surface, they could only talk to each other and to mission control by using their radios in their air-filled helmets. Even when astronauts in the photo on the right hit the metal tube into the ground with a hammer, no sound was made. Unfortunately for NASA, the photograph shown was of the very act of hammering in the flagpole, which Jet Windsor has identified as causing the sound. In August of 2011, the page suddenly disappeared, presumably removed by NASA, but with no explanation. One needs to ponder why. NASA's statement that the astronaut spacesuit acted like a sound drum, even if that is plausible, is disproved by Windsor. He identifies a significant incident in the Apollo 15 video footage as astronaut James Irwin throws a metal band into the air which hits the lunar module and makes a distinct sound. This act totally negates the reasoning given by NASA for hearing the hammer blows because the spacesuit acted like a drum, as in this case there is no contact between the astronaut and the source of the sound. Conclusions. So let's recap on what we have discovered. The first suggested anomaly of not hearing any sound from the rocket noise from the lunar lander at descent or liftoff could be a misunderstanding on the part of the skeptics in that they assumed that the astronauts were not wearing their spacesuits. The Apollo Lunar Surface Journal is clear on this matter, and astronauts would be wearing their spacesuits if they followed the correct procedures. If they were wearing their spacesuits, then the sound of the rocket may well be shielded from their inner helmet microphones. The second suggested anomaly is a little more challenging to explain. The video evidence is unambiguous in that the distinct sounds can be heard when there should not have been any sound. The explanation provided by NASA is that the spacesuits acted like a drum to transmit the sound to the astronaut's internal microphone is proved false by Jet Windsor in the James Irwin metal band throwing incident. The very fact that NASA removed the website for kids suggests that NASA may have something to hide. Also, the paucity of the pro-NASA believers' contributions to this subject is equally telling. Sounds should not be possible on the surface of the moon, but you can hear them in the NASA videos, which is clear proof that the video was not made on the moon, but here on Earth. As Jet Windsor comments, this could be a smoking gun, and he is certainly correct. The James Irwin metal band throwing incident is clear, irrefutable proof of the NASA fakery. There is no other feasible explanation for this. Diminished technology. My dull brain was wrought with things forgotten. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. At the time President Kennedy made his famous Man on the Moon speech to Congress on 25 May 1961, only one American had been briefly into space. Alan Shepard was launched into space aboard Mercury 3 on 5 May 1961 to become the first American in space. His capsule did not achieve orbit, but rose to a height of 116 miles and traveled 303 miles before safely parachuting into the Atlantic Ocean. This was not on a rocket specifically designed for space travel, but on the top of a hastily adapted Redstone ballistic missile. So to say the timing for Kennedy's moon speech was totally surprising is an understatement. Apollo Project. NASA was left with the almost impossible task of designing and building all the hardware to get men a further 240,000 miles all the way to the moon and hopefully home safely. As it transpired, well, at least according to NASA, it turned out to be relatively easy. In just 7.5 years, NASA had made everything needed to reach and orbit the moon with the Apollo 8 mission on 21 December 1968 and the first moon landing with the Apollo 11 on 20 July 1969. Work did not start on the Saturn series of rockets until mid-1960, but by 1963 the final version of the mighty Saturn V rocket was designed. Work started in November 1961 in the Command and Service Module designed by North American Aviation. The first flight of the assembled hardware was the unmanned Apollo 4 mission on 9 November 1967. Remarkably, just 1 year later in 1968 followed the Apollo 8 manned mission to orbit the moon, quickly followed in 1969 by the Apollo 11 moon landing. This timeline of development is nothing less than remarkable. One needs to remember that all this was back in the 1960s when technology and manufacturing methods were primitive compared to what we have today. More than 60% of the population on Earth today were born after the 1960s, so it must be difficult for those people to appreciate what technology was available to them at that time. There were virtually no useful computers to enable computer-aided design, no robotic manufacturing techniques to enable accurate, speedy assembly, and no sophisticated circuitry to enable reliable command and control systems. The engineers used slide rules for the design calculations, and draftsmen sat at draft boards with pencil in hand. According to NASA, all of this was achieved in less than 8 years. You may be wondering, what is a slide rule? Well, it isn't much more than a wooden stick with algorithms inscribed on several scales. I can remember them well when I started studying to be a civil engineer at university in 1961. I found this interesting video from MIT Alumni Association which describes the mysteries of the gadget. Imagine that you didn't have that little app on your smartphone and you needed to get your head around this procedure just to calculate your expenses. Just another quick interjection here. It is widely reported that NASA discovered that pens didn't work in the weightlessness of space, and it is rumored that they spent $165,000 on designing the space pen that worked in the weightlessness environment of space. The Russians simply used pencils. The Apollo project was originally intended to include missions 18, 19, and 20, but these missions were cancelled in September 1970, just 18 months after the supposedly successful Apollo moon landing and 6 months after the supposed Apollo 13 near tragedy. According to Wikipedia, several planned missions of the Apollo manned moon landing program of the 1960s and 70s were cancelled for a variety of reasons, including changes in technical direction, the Apollo 1 fire, hardware delays, and budget limitations. After the landing by Apollo 12, Apollo 20, which would have been the final manned mission to the moon, was cancelled to allow Skylab to launch as a dry workshop, which was assembled on the ground in an unused Saturn 4B, Saturn 1B second stage. The next two missions, Apollo 18 and 19, were later cancelled, and the Apollo 13 incident and further budget cuts. Two Skylab missions also ended up being cancelled. Two complete Saturn V's ended up going unused and are currently on display in multiple locations around the United States. The original plan for the Apollo missions envisaged that Apollo 18, 19, and 20 would fly in 1972. The delay caused by Apollo 13's near tragedy meant that the Apollo 17 was rescheduled to December 1972, so 15 months later than originally anticipated. NASA put the calculations down to budgetary problems, but more likely that they couldn't feel that they could carry on the fakery much longer. The budget limitations reason is hardly plausible given that all the main expenditure on the Apollo 5 rockets, the spacecrafts, and the associated systems that were relatively paid for via contracts and the hardware was at the time well on the way to being finished. The real reason is understandable. NASA needed to distance itself from the moon landings and perhaps couldn't imagine continuing the deceit for years to come with more fake moon trips. NASA clearly needed a new direction to divert attention from the moon, and the laboratory in Skylab was the answer. It wasn't as though NASA had finished with the moon, as previously they had many plans to colonize the moon for scientific research, mineral exploration, and eventually a moon base. Imagine how much more sensible it would have been to site a space telescope on the moon where it could be well maintained. Instead, NASA concentrated on inner Earth orbit projects like Skylab and the International Space Station. So we have a project which took just 8 years to get men on the moon. If modern technology and computer-aided design and manufacturing had been available at that time, I imagine this could have been achieved in just 5 years. We can now compare this with all the subsequent NASA efforts to get men back on the moon with the Constellation program and now the ongoing Orion project. Constellation program. In 2004, President Bush announced that they would revive the moon missions with the Constellation program, often referred to as Apollo on steroids. The Constellation program was active between 2005 and 2009. It was subsequently cancelled in 2009 by President Barack Obama on 1st February 2010, reportedly for lack of funding. The logo of the Constellation program reflected the ambitious 3 aims of the program to get men in low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station resides, the Moon, and then finally Mars. One stated goal of the Constellation program was to get men back on the Moon no later than 2020. So this time, NASA allowed themselves a good 16 years to achieve what they had done back in the 1960s for the Apollo project in just 7.5 years, but even this seems to have been too ambitious. Orion. Orion was started in 2004 with the design of the Space Launch System SLS, for which Boeing was awarded the contract. It was originally under the Constellation program, which we have seen was cancelled, but the Orion project picked up the pieces of what was left. Already, the Orion project is suffering delays and cost overruns. Not only is NASA experiencing problems with its own design, it is likely that private companies will produce the required hardware at a fraction of the cost. It is probable that NASA will have spent £18 million and the project which may as well be abandoned. All I can say at this point is that NASA does create some excellent logo designs. The moon is beginning to look farther and farther away as each year passes. It is unlikely that we will see any men on the moon, if we ever do, until the 2030s. Naturally, the question you're dying to ask is why not use the tried and tested successful Apollo technology? Well, it seems that NASA just threw away that successful technology somehow, somewhere. Why not use the Apollo technology? NASA has shown lamentable custodianship of important historical artifacts concerning the Apollo missions and the total disregard for managing technological value. No doubt our skeptics would argue that this is not a question of good custodianship, but more of a deliberate and concentrated attempt to destroy evidence that may be judged to be incriminating when examined with modern methods of analysis. Without question, these losses of artifacts are most epic in scale, and one has to question why NASA has been so determinately careless. The Apollo moon landings have been heralded as one of the greatest achievements of mankind, and one would expect that all of the documentation and technical achievements would be carefully preserved for posterity. Regrettably and quite surprisingly, this does not seem to have been the case. It would appear that NASA has been less than conscientious in preserving these important artifacts. This is astonishing for two reasons. First and foremost, the historical nature of the achievement. In this modern era, we tend to hold as precious everything that measures the progress and achievements of mankind. Secondly, the information was undoubtedly of considerable usefulness for future space projects. Now, NASA plans to go back into outer space with the Orion project and appears to be struggling to build the technology with which to do this. Skeptics would strongly argue, vociferously, that we supposedly had the technology to leave Earth orbit and survive in space 50 years ago. They question how NASA could have been so utterly careless, or were there other impelling reasons for this perceived ineptitude. The suspicion is there for the skeptics to add to their arguments that NASA faked the moon landings and is now trying to destroy anything that could ultimately prove the fakery, particularly when examined with modern methods of analysis.